All right, this is today's project. We have got here a broken plastic launcher, and this is part of a kit for elementary school students that are exploring the concepts of physics, motion. So this broke, and you can kind of see where it broke, like right there. And we're going to try to recreate this because this kit is pretty much useless without a launcher. So here's some of the features that I got to be aware of. The launcher itself has to have a bit of a cup there so that the object can sit nicely inside of there. And just nice details there, like the top part here where the finger is going to pull back on this launcher. Then you have the base. Yeah, let's see what we can come up with. All right, it's time to get started with this launcher. We're going to start off with a box, and this box I'm going to resize. This is going to serve as the base, so it's going to have a height of 5 millimeters and a width of 3.5 centimeters or 35 millimeters. Now for the rounded portion of this base, I'm going to use a cylinder, and this cylinder is going to have a diameter of 5 centimeters or 50 millimeters. I'm going to give it a height of 5 millimeters. And together as a base, they should have an overall length of 12.5 centimeters. So basically taking this box here and extending it 10 centimeters and having it end at the midpoint of my cylinder there should give me 12.5 centimeters. Now, I'll be honest with you here, I totally lucked out and nailed it by hitting the center point of that cylinder. I was prepared to use the ruler here, but I'll take the win. All right, just a matter here of aligning them so that they are centered to each other. And it's time to group it. Okay, so next it was time to design the piece that extends up from the base and where that launching arm was going to attach to. For this, I just used the sketch tool. Again, I love this because I can see where the existing base is and I can use that as a reference and basically start off with a basic shape here. I knew that I was going to come back to this to readjust it, resize it. So just to have some basic shape to start with and then be able to build my launch arm off of this. And here I'm just sizing it to that 3.5 centimeters in depth and just making sure that it is aligned to that base piece. So coming up next, it was time to think about this launching arm. Now, thinking back to that original piece and where it broke, it was right around here where that arm snapped off. And dealing with PLA, this is a plastic that's much more brittle and not as flexible. So I wanted to come up with a solution that would allow it to have that spring-like action and not have it break after repeated use. So I brought in the sketch tool here because I wanted to add in a new feature to this launching arm. I wanted to add in these waves or the zigzag pattern to this launcher arm to serve as a bit of a spring there that would allow this part of the arm to flex and hopefully not break. I've seen other designers use something similar for these very simple print-in-place hinges. I thought maybe it might work here. So I'm just using the sketch tool here, plotting out points, and this is where those measurement numbers popping up come in handy because I can clearly see the distances between those plotted points and I can ensure that this zigzag pattern that I'm creating is exactly how I want it. Also, this new feature in Sketch, which they just added in, where I can basically create a shape off of a line that I've just plotted down, is fantastic. I just click the check mark and I can then start to fill in around that line to create my shape. And for this launch arm, I'm giving it a thickness of 2 millimeters. So here I'm just basically selecting each individual point where there is a sharp corner and I'm converting them over to rounded corners by selecting that option down here along the bottom. All right, so now exiting out of this sketch, again, I'm just going to resize this so that it has this depth of 3.5 centimeters and make sure it's aligned properly to the base. Okay, so now it's time to add in the rest of the arm here. And actually, rather than adding in a box, I just went back to another sketch. Now, for me, when I use the sketch tool, especially if I'm using another pre-existing shape on my work plane as a reference, I really want to ensure that the grid lines of my sketch match up with the lines or a surface on my reference object. So what I often do is I back out of the sketch, select the object as well as the sketch, and then align it so that the edges as well as the plotted points align with and snap to these grid lines. And here, because they are now properly aligned, it's easy for me to extend another sketch that is in line with that pre-existing zigzag shape. And like before, I just exit out, resize it, and just make sure it's in line with the rest of the launcher. And even though it is a sketched shape, it is still just a shape. So I can just resize it by taking that grab point and extending it any distance that I like. Okay, so the next part here, I'm trying to recreate the angle at which the arm is coming off of that hinge on that base. And because the original launcher was broken, I had really no way of measuring it. So I just tried to piece it back as closely as I could. And I just did the measurement from the base to the height of that launcher arm, or at least estimated it. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm basically taking this red block and I'm basically using it as a reference here. I measured the distance between the base and the top of this launch arm to about 4 centimeters using the original launcher. And so after that, I'm basically trying to angle up this arm so that it matches that height as well as allows me to connect it to the top of that hinge found at the front end of that launcher base. And here I just keep going back and forth, adjusting that height, changing that angle until I get it just right. Okay, so here it's time to add that little tab at the end of this launcher arm. This is where the finger is going to push down on the lever and basically release the launcher. So this was another sketch that I basically added on to the pre-existing sketch of that arm. Again, having that launcher arm in the background allows me to draw this sketch so that there are no gaps between this tab and the launcher arm. And resizing this piece, making sure it's aligned properly to the base and the launcher. Looks good. Actually, I'll be honest with you, I kept changing this and I actually increased the angle one more time. So it was a steeper angle on the launcher, but I don't need to show that. You get the idea. Now, taking my design cues from the original, I had to add in some additional supports on the underside of this launcher arm, specifically where the tab meets that angled arm. They had some additional supports here to help bolster it and make sure it wasn't going to break every time this launcher arm was pushed down. And again, the sketch allows me to ensure that there's enough overlap here so that there are no gaps or breaks between the supporting piece and the rest of the launcher arm. And resizing it and aligning it and all of that kind of stuff just allows you to quickly ensure that this supporting piece is in the right place. And of course, for the other side, just duplicate this piece and align it to the opposite side of this launcher arm. Easy. Okay, so here I'm going to add in some raised bumps just to signify that this is where the finger is supposed to push down on this lever. Again, it's a design cue that I saw back on the original, and I'm just going to use this half cylinder. I think they call it a round roof shape in Tinkercad. I'm going to size it down just to about 1.5 millimeters in height and make sure it's centered to that pad, duplicate it, move it, and then duplicate it again. All right, it's time to add in the cup that is actually found on the launcher arm. This indentation so that you can actually have pieces sitting on this arm and not just simply rolling off the arm. So this was interesting because this took actually a lot of time and thought on my part. I was kind of stumped here as to how I was going to do this. I knew it was going to involve a sphere as well as a cutout of a sphere, but the positioning of it, how big I should make the sphere, how was I going to set this into the arm, would I need to take things apart? It took a little bit. Now, I've chosen to edit most of that out because let's just get to the good parts, and this is how I ended up doing it. So as you saw in the preceding footage here, I took this oversized sphere, made sure it was centered to this launch arm, and then sunk it into the launch arm just before the edges of that sphere crept over the edges of that launch arm. I then took a duplicate of that sphere and set it off to the side because this would serve as my cutout later on. I made this duplicate 4 millimeters smaller in diameter compared to the original because this would leave me 2 millimeters of wall thickness on either side once this cutout was applied. Okay, so here I'm going to use a box cutout shape and I'm going to drag it onto the surface of that angled launch arm. After that, I'm just going to resize this cutout so that it is large enough to take out the rest of that sphere. Once I group these objects, you can clearly see now what's left behind is that sphere that is now left embedded in the launch arm. All right, next it's time to apply that cutout, taking that smaller sphere that I created earlier, turning it into a hole, making sure it is aligned to that launcher dead center, and placing it so that it starts to cut away from that sphere that was embedded into our launch arm. Now this was a little bit more tricky because it was at an angle. I had to nudge this a little bit here and there just so I could see that this hole or cutout was centered to the sphere that was embedded into the launch arm. And this was a little bit of trial and error here, going back and forth, because not only did I have to be aware of the alignment on the X and Y axis, but also along the Z axis as well. Now, my biggest concern here was making sure that the alignment of this cutout wasn't going to leave me with walls or a cup that was too thin. So the transparency tool really came in handy here. Selecting this object and then pressing T, I can clearly see just the thickness of that cup. And sure enough, it was a little too thin for my liking. So backing out of this, ungrouping this object, and repositioning this cutout, I could ensure that there was enough of a thickness there in that launch cup. So let's select these shapes again and group them, or Control G, to see what this looks like. And again, checking it out by selecting the object and making it transparent, I can clearly see now that the cup has a thickness or a wall thickness that is appropriate. It was starting to look like the launcher. Now, on the original launcher, there is a little small support structure at the base where the hinge is, and it just angles upward to help support where that launcher arm attaches to that hinge. And of course, I'm back in Sketch, and this is again just another easy little piece to add in when I can clearly see where all the other pieces are in my build. And again, this is just a small little piece that I caught at the base of this arm. So I just resized it a few millimeters wide and just made sure it was centered to the base of the launcher. And again, because this is a sketch, it is so easy to re-enter the sketch if I want to make any adjustments afterwards. No problem. All right, I think that is everything. I just selected this, grouped it all together, and it was time to print this out and see if it actually worked. All right, here it is. Let's take it off the printer and let's test it. All right, here it is. This is the new one. This is the one that it replaced. That was broken. I did go with this spring-like type of piece here just because of the inability for PLA to flex and bend. And I just wanted to see, I just got a random small plastic piece here that I had on the side. So, it works. It works. Not too bad. I mean, it really does launch it up straight like this, so I'm not quite sure if it should be launching it more like this. I don't know. I may have to chat with the teacher. Curious to see what the original launcher would have done, how it performed, but pretty happy with this. And it does become easy to make modifications to it once you have that plan down. See, this is what I love. Now I'm playing with it, so maybe it is maybe it is working. Anyway, very happy with that. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you on the next video.